What are the W-9 rules? The W-9 rules state before you ever pay someone for a service, you have to get the W-9. If you pay somebody to provide a service, meaning they're doing work, they're not providing you goods, you're supposed to either collect a W-9 or a W-4 before you ever pay them. Now, we're all familiar with the W-4. You need that to process payroll. But most of the time, people ignore the W-9 rules, thinking they don't have to deal with them until they hit January, super scary, or until they pay the person over $600. Good luck trying to get a W-9 after you've paid people. But beyond the service providers, there are also rental companies and landlords. We're supposed to be providing a 1099 miscellaneous form to anybody we pay rent to, and that includes renting equipment. You hear that, folks? Rent, including renting equipment. So every landlord you have, whether it's for your storage unit or your office space, or some annex area where people are working, or you're storing your goods and services, right? Whatever it is, if it's related to rent, you need to have a W-9 on file because you probably have to give that person a 1099. Now, one plug right here, because we are going to be talking about forms and if you should do paper or electronic. Most people do not have very many 1099 miscellaneous forms, right? Because a few years back, they moved all the service providers to the NEC form after they resuscitated that form that hadn't been used since the 80s. And so now there's a special 1099 NEC form. Non-employee compensation is what those words mean, what those letters mean. Non-employee compensation. And so the idea is that you give a 1099 NEC form instead of giving people a W-2 for people that provided services to your company, but they are not employees. Next thing is that we have the rental companies and the landlords, and those are a 1099 MISC form, MISC standing for miscellaneous. Those forms, usually you only need one or two of them, and so it would make sense to submit those forms electronically because you're not going to need a whole packet of them. And for those of you that only have one or two 1099 NECs, that might lead you to doing electronic for them as well. Because the first thing that you want to think about when you're thinking about your 1099s and your W-9 audit is, where are you coding the expenses? It is so vital to make sure that you have chart of accounts set up so that you can, for the most part, segregate any service provider expenses and have them in a separate account. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you use subcontractors as part of doing jobs for clients, then you would have a subcontractor account. And we would hope that you don't have any materials mixed in, right? That it's all just subcontractors. And then as I say that, I want to pause here and tell you, a few years ago, I went to an employment law conference and I asked them specifically, if we pay a subcontractor for services and materials, are the materials mandatory reporting on the 1099, or should they be excluded from the 1099? Meaning, if you buy materials and services from the plumber that helps you with projects, should the materials you pay for be separate or added? And the answer was they don't care. Okay, so from a government standpoint, all they care about is getting a 1099 for the services paid for, but it is absolutely fine to also include the materials. So for that plumber, we don't have to break up their bill between subcontractors and job materials unless we want to for managerial purposes, internal. We don't need to worry about it legally for federal requirements. Make sense? Okay, so where are you coding these expenses? It really does matter. Some of the things that I see done wrong all the time are people that have temp employees. So they hire people from a temp agency. I know they're called employees, but they're not. Any temp services either needs its own account or it should be put in with the subcontractors, independent contractors. What people get wrong all the time is they code temp employees to your payroll labor accounts, which is absolutely inaccurate. And the system that we are creating right now would miss any vendors that were miscoded. And that's why we're bringing this topic up first. The system I'm going to show you works great, but it only works great if we're coding things correctly. And coding things correctly is a foundational component to being a bookkeeper. So, the only accounts that I would normally see that are mixed between goods and services, and it's okay, it's not a big deal, are the repair and maintenance categories, right? So you might have repair and maintenance for vehicles or repair and maintenance for your facilities, and you might put both goods and services in that account. That's fine, unless you have a company where you have a lot of repair and maintenance, like for your vehicles. If you have a huge fleet of vehicles and you've got tons of repair and maintenance expenses, both for service providers and for goods, like you're buying parts to repair in-house, it would make sense to have two separate accounts if you have a ton of activity. So I say that because you have to make the right decision for the company you're working for and the industry you're in. But coding things correctly does matter. And in general, those of you who are using Intuit products, I will tell you that the QuickBooks Online default chart of accounts are some of the worst chart of accounts setup I've ever seen and cause a ton of problems. So if there's anyone watching this series and you've never had somebody that's an accounting professional step in and actually look at your accounting framework and get it set up in the best way for your industry, I would encourage you to do that. Because if you're using defaults that were set up by QuickBooks, especially QuickBooks Online, you might have a pretty big mess going on. Okay. One other thing to keep in mind is we got to make sure that we don't have anything in uncategorized expenses. That's something you're much more likely to see with QuickBooks Online, but do not allow anything in your accounts that are named uncategorized. We need to make sure that as we're going into fall and going into tax season, that we don't have things buried like independent contractor payments that then we're going to end up finding way too late and having to deal with emergencies. All right, so what we're going to be doing is creating some memorized reports. We're going to do this exercise both in QuickBooks Online and QuickBooks Desktop, and I'm going to be providing you a standard operating procedure, including how to correctly enter information into QuickBooks. QuickBooks Online has a pretty bad glitch in that if you don't enter the information exactly correct, depending on how you set that vendor up, Intuit will delete your data. Yes, I just said that out loud. Intuit is actively deleting data depending on what choice you make when you're setting up the W-9 information for your vendor, and that can cause a pretty big issue. So we have to do this jerry-rigging of QuickBooks Online to get the information in the right place so it shows up accurately. Not very fun, but we'll show you how to do it.